John McAllister Schofield was born in September of 1831 in Jerry, New York. He came from a very well-connected, politically active family and gained an appointment eventually to West Point. And of the several classmates that he would have there, one of his classmates, roommates, and even friends would be not only John Bell Hood, but he would also be close associates with General James Birdsey McPherson, who of course is shot down in the Atlanta campaign. Schofield's military career, really leading up to the American Civil War, is one of incredible interest because he graduates from the academy in 1853. He stays in the pre-war army, but in 1860 we actually find him taking an extended period of leave. He becomes a mathematics professor at Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri. And when the war breaks out in 1861, he actually goes right back to the army and serves in the Army of the Frontier under General Nathaniel Lyon, but of course Lyon's killed at Wilson's Creek. It is the action, of course, that will see him gain the Medal of Honor by the 1890s. By 1864, we find him a participant, in fact, a leading figure in the Tennessee campaign, which will come right through, actually the road behind me. John Schofield is the commander of the 23rd Corps of the Army of the Ohio, and he is given this sort of unenviable task by the commander of the Nashville Defenses and the commander of the Army of the Cumberland, General George Henry Thomas. Thomas, knowing that John Bell Hood and his Confederate Army are preparing to cross the Tennessee River, begins to put out the call for troops, and they're going to come from across the state and from other regions. But to buy time for Nashville's defenses to become prepared and readied, John Schofield is ordered to slow down John Bell Hood's advance into Tennessee, harass him wherever possible, and do the best that they can to try and buy Nashville's defenses that desperately needed time, or destroy Hood's army somewhere south of Nashville. Schofield, with his 23rd Corps, moves and will actually combine forces with David Stanley's 4th Corps of the Army of the Cumberland, giving Schofield roughly some 28,000 to 30,000 men, and they'll move from Pulaski to Columbia, here to Spring Hill. And the Spring Hill episode in John Schofield's career is by and large probably his greatest night in his career as a soldier. November the 29th of 1864, John Bell Hood and his Confederate Army began a daring flanking maneuver to try and get behind Schofield's lines to the town of Spring Hill, cut off Schofield from Nashville, and on the morning of November the 30th, Hood had intended to destroy his old West Point classmate and friend's army here at Spring Hill, but would wake up to find on the morning of November the 30th that throughout that evening, John Schofield had conducted probably the most daring escape in the history of the United States Army, certainly the most daring escape throughout the entire American Civil War. On the morning of November the 29th, becoming aware of Hood's intentions, Schofield began the evacuation of his supply wagons and his artillery out of Columbia north towards Spring Hill and eventually on to Franklin, and then that evening managed to move his infantry columns along with all the remaining baggage of the army, some 6,000 draft animals total, right past the Confederates in the middle of the night, and arrived at Franklin around 4 in the morning. And there discovering that the bridges over the Harpeth River, it had long been said that the river was swollen and that it was at flood stages. Well, it's simply not true. A flood had come through about 2 weeks earlier and damaged the county bridges and the footbridge, but by the time Schofield had arrived, water levels had dropped, but the bridges were still impassable. And so the only way that John Schofield could get his army out of Franklin is by organizing a crossing of the Nashville and Decatur Railway Trestle, implementing the skills of his Corps of Engineers. Schofield has been criticized for many, many years for taking a kind of hands-off approach during the battle. Well, he's exactly where an army commander should be. Places General Jacob Cox in command of the federal troops on the south side of town and makes his way over to the Truett House, which will serve as his headquarters before eventually moving to Fort Granger to oversee the battle from there. Certainly one of the things about John Schofield and his legacy is that it's often been marred by these really unjust and unfair criticisms. And then to talk about him during the battle and say that he was a coward and that he was toward the rear of the lines and he wasn't taking an active hand in command, it misses the point entirely of what his objective that day was. It was to get the army safely out of Franklin and onto Nashville. And for all the times that we hear people's criticisms of John Bell Hood, and they say he was too aggressive and he was too up close to the fight and there was too much danger and he exposed his army to these terrible, awful casualties, people also throw the same level of criticism in maybe a different way and maybe under a different motivation towards John Schofield. And it's a criticism that I think is largely undeserved. Schofield is where an army commander should be throughout the entire fight, to the rear, observing what's happening, and relaying orders to very, very competent subordinates. but it's not without Schofield's direction. So no, he's not a battlefield commander. No, he's not going to lead daring, kind of gallant charges into the fray, but he is an incredible military mind, and we certainly see that play out in his post-war years. He served as the Secretary of War, succeeding Edwin Stanton, 1868 to 69, and by the time we roll around to 1876, he's appointed as the superintendent of the Academy at West Point. And this is where we really start to see John Schofield take on an incredibly important role, certainly an influential role, in the history of the United States Army. The army that he builds at the Academy is wrought with reforms. He turns the army into this professional service and really builds the armies that we will see fight the Spanish-American War of 1898 and the First World War. But by the time we roll around to 1880 and 1881, we find that Schofield is embroiled in controversy with the court-martial and eventual expulsion of a young black cadet by the name of Johnson Whitaker. Whitaker claimed to have been beaten, and he was attacked by his fellow cadets, and the controversy mires John Schofield's administration of West Point to the point where he's actually removed as the superintendent. By the time John Schofield reaches 1892, he's reaching the very end of his career in the Army, and it's in this time period as well that he will accept a nomination for the Congressional Medal of Honor for his actions performed at Wilson's Creek. And one of the other great criticisms of his Medal of Honor decoration is that he nominated himself and that he awarded it to himself. He still did perform something incredibly admirable. John Schofield, in so many ways, was the right man at the right place at the right time, who did just enough to stop the Confederate advance into Middle Tennessee. And we can play the what-if card all day long. Well, whatever he did, he marched up the Columbia Turnpike, and he carried out this incredibly daring escape, and it sets up the Battle of Franklin, where Hood's army is irrevocably destroyed. And John Schofield creates this legacy here in Spring Hill and Franklin, and he carries that legacy through the rest of the war and through the rest of his life. When he dies in 1906, he goes to the grave not only a decorated soldier, a politician, but as a man who did his service to the United States and ensured that the experiment would continue for us to be a part of today. And that, I think, is his ultimate legacy.